You're standing in a trench somewhere in East Africa, 1915. The air is thick with humidity and the stench of rot. Your rifle is loaded, your bayonet fixed, but you're not waiting for enemy soldiers. You're waiting for something far worse, something that's already killed more men in this war than bullets ever will, something that weighs less than a paperclip, but has toppled empires, halted armies, and rewritten the course of human history more times than we can count. And then you hear it. That high-pitched whine near your ear. Throughout history, humanity has faced countless enemies. We've battled each other, sure, but we've also gone to war against nature itself. And here's the thing that'll blow your mind. We've lost. A lot. We're talking about creatures so devastating, so apocalyptically destructive, that they make our worst nightmares look like Saturday morning cartoons. These aren't your typical predators. Most of them you could crush with your thumb. But what they lack in size, they make up for in sheer, unfathomable body count. Today, we're diving into the absolute worst creatures humans have ever had to fight. And I'm not talking about lions or bears or sharks. Those are child's play. I'm talking about the organisms that have killed hundreds of millions of us, that have brought civilizations to their knees, that have fundamentally altered the trajectory of human history. We're talking about the real monsters. And trust me, by the end of this video, you'll never look at your backyard the same way again. Part 1, The Tiny Terror. Chapter 1, The Plague of Athens. Let's start with a bang, shall we? 430 BC, Athens, Greece. You're at the absolute peak of classical civilization. Democracy is thriving. Philosophy is booming. Art and culture are flourishing. Athens is the superpower of the Mediterranean world. The Parthenon is gleaming white on the Acropolis. Socrates is walking around asking annoying questions. Everything is going absolutely swimmingly. And then people start dying. Not just a few people. A lot of people. And not dying peacefully in their sleep either. We're talking about a disease so horrific that the historian Thucydides, who actually survived it, described scenes that would make a horror movie director weep with envy. People developed sudden fevers that made them feel like they were burning alive from the inside. Their skin turned red and broke out in pustules and ulcers. They became so desperately thirsty that they would throw themselves into wells and water cisterns, contaminating the water supply and spreading the disease even further. But here's where it gets really dark. The disease attacked people's minds too. Victims became delirious, forgot who they were, and wandered the streets in a daze before collapsing dead in the gutters. The stench of rotting corpses filled the air because there were too many bodies to bury. Funeral pyres burned day and night. Birds and animals that fed on the corpses died immediately. The few dogs that were around, gone, just dead. Athens lost somewhere between a quarter and a third of its entire population in just a few years. We're talking about 75 to 100,000 people dead. The military lost its commander, Pericles, arguably one of the greatest leaders in Greek history. The social fabric of the city completely unraveled. People stopped following laws because, hey, why bother when you might be dead tomorrow? Religious ceremonies were abandoned. Families stopped burying their dead properly and just tossed bodies onto other people's funeral pyres when no one was looking. The Spartans, Athens' enemies in the Peloponnesian War, were literally camped outside the city walls, ready to attack. But they took one look at what was happening inside Athens and said nope and went home. Even the Spartans, literal professional warriors who were trained from childhood to never retreat, were like, we're not dealing with that. Now here's the kicker. We still don't know exactly what caused the plague of Athens. Scientists have debated it for centuries. Typhoid fever, Ebola, smallpox, some weird strain of disease that doesn't even exist anymore. Nobody knows for sure. Some researchers tested DNA from ancient teeth found in a mass grave and suggested typhoid, but others aren't convinced. What we do know is that this mysterious disease fundamentally changed the course of Western civilization. Athens never fully recovered. The war dragged on. Athens eventually lost, and the golden age of Greece came to an end. All because of a creature so small we can't even see it without a microscope. And that's just the opening act. Chapter 2: The Antonine Plague. Fast forward about 600 years. It's 165 AD, and Rome is having a moment. The Roman Empire is at its absolute zenith. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, is in charge. The empire stretches from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Sahara. Roads crisscross the known world. Aqueducts bring fresh water to millions. The Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, has created the most prosperous period in ancient history. Life is good. Roman legions are returning victorious from campaigns in the east, having thoroughly defeated the Parthian Empire. They're marching home while in triumph, loaded with loot and glory, ready to parade through Rome and bask in their well-earned fame. They bring something else home too. Within months, people across the empire start dying. And once again, the symptoms are absolutely nightmare. High fever, vomiting, diarrhea, and here's the special touch: putrefying sores all over the body that turned black and gangrenous. Victims literally rotted while still alive. The smell was so bad that people could identify infected houses from blocks away. The Greek physician Galen, who actually witnessed and documented the plague, described black pustules that covered the entire body, and a throat so swollen that victims couldn't swallow. Many people died within days of showing symptoms. Some historians believe this was smallpox making its grand entrance onto the Western stage. If so, humanity was completely unprepared for it. The death toll? Conservative estimates say 5 million people. That's conservative. Some historians think it could have been as high as 10 to 15 million, which would be roughly 10 to 15% of the entire empire's population. Entire towns were depopulated. The Roman army lost so many soldiers that they had to recruit gladiators and German barbarians just to keep the legions functional. The economy collapsed in many regions because there literally weren't enough people left to farm the fields or work in the trades. Here's something that'll give you chills. The plague kept coming back. It returned in waves for about 15 years, each time killing more people, each time weakening the empire a little more. Marcus Aurelius himself probably died of it in 180 AD. His son Commodus, the guy who was played by Joaquin Phoenix's nemesis in Gladiator, inherited a dying empire. And Commodus was, let's be honest, absolutely terrible at his job. The empire never fully recovered. Historians debate whether the Antonine Plague was the beginning of the end for Rome. It took another 300 years for the Western Roman Empire to finally collapse. But the damage from this plague, the economic devastation, the military weakness, the loss of faith in the government's ability to protect its people, all of that started here. One tiny organism hitching a ride with victorious soldiers brought the greatest empire the world had ever seen to its knees. But we're just getting started. Chapter 3: The Black Death Cometh. All right, let's talk about the big one, the plague that everyone knows about, the one that makes all other plagues look like a mild case of the sniffles. We're going to medieval Europe in 1347, and things are about to get dark. Like, historically, apocalyptically dark. You're a merchant in Kaffa, a trading port on the Black Sea in Crimea. Business is booming. Goods flow in from Asia along the Silk Road. Silks, spices, precious metals, exotic goods. Life is pretty good for a medieval merchant. You're making money hand over fist. Then the Mongols show up and lay siege to your city. This is bad, but sieges happen. You've got walls, you've got supplies, you can wait them out. But then something weird happens. The Mongols start dying. Like, a lot of them are dying. They're dropping dead in their camps. Their army is falling apart, and they're getting desperate. So they do something that will haunt humanity for centuries. They load their dead bodies onto catapults and hurl them over the city walls. Yep, medieval biological warfare. The ultimate, if we're going down, we're taking you with us move. You and your fellow merchants flee the city, jumping on ships and sailing for home. You're heading back to Italy, to Genoa, to Venice, to safety. You have no idea that you're carrying with you the single most devastating organism in human history. You're about to unleash hell on Earth. When those ships dock in Italian ports in October 1347, the nightmare begins. Within days, people start developing these grotesque swellings in their groins, armpits, and necks. We call them buboes, which is where bubonic plague gets its name. These buboes are incredibly painful, filled with pus and blood, and they grow to the size of apples. The skin around them turns black and rots, giving the plague its infamous nickname, the Black Death. But the buboes are just the beginning. Victims develop massive fevers, chills, vomiting, and diarrhea. They cough up blood. Their skin turns black in patches as the tissue dies. Many people are dead within 3 to 5 days of showing symptoms. Some die within 24 hours. Some fall ill in the morning and are dead by evening. The mortality rate is somewhere between 30 and 60%. Let that sink in. If you catch this thing, you have, at best, a 50-50 chance of survival. At worst, you're basically already dead. And it spreads like wildfire. By 1348, it swept through Italy, France, Spain, and England. By 1349, it's in Germany, Scandinavia, and Eastern Europe. By 1351, it's reached Russia. Nowhere is safe. Cities, towns, villages, monasteries, castles, it doesn't matter. The plague finds everyone. The symptoms are so horrific that people think it's the literal end of the world. And honestly, can you blame them? Their religious leaders tell them it's God's punishment for sin. Flagellants roam the countryside, whipping themselves bloody to atone. Others blame the Jews and carry out horrific pogroms, burning entire communities alive. None of it helps, of course, because the real culprit is a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, carried by fleas on rats, and medieval people have no idea about germ theory. Here's what really happened. The plague travels the Silk Road from Central Asia, where it's been endemic in rodent populations for centuries. Climate change, yes, even in medieval times, disrupts these rodent populations and forces them into contact with humans. Fleas carrying Yersinia pestis bite humans, regurgitate the bacteria into the wound, and boom, infection. The bacteria multiply in the lymph nodes, creating those horrible buboes, and then spread through the bloodstream. In some cases, it gets into the lungs, creating pneumonic plague, which is even worse because now it can spread person to person through coughing. Pneumonic plague has a mortality rate near 100% if untreated. You breathe in some droplets from a sick person's cough, and you're done. Dead in a day or two. No survivors. Game over. Medieval doctors try everything. They burn aromatic herbs to purify the air. They lance the buboes and drain the pus. They prescribe bizarre treatments like drinking mercury or ground up emeralds. Some doctors wear those famous bird beak masks stuffed with herbs and spices, thinking it'll protect them. Spoiler alert, it doesn't. Doctors die at the same rate as everyone else, which means soon there aren't any doctors left. The social fabric of Europe completely disintegrates. There aren't enough people to bury the dead, so bodies pile up in the streets. Mass graves are dug outside every city, huge pits where thousands of bodies are dumped and covered with lime. The death carts come through towns every morning. Bring out your dead. It's not a Monty Python joke, it's actual historical reality. Entire villages are abandoned. Farms go untended because there's no one left to work them. Crops rot in the fields. Animals starve in their pens. The economy collapses because there's no one to buy or sell anything. Trade grinds to a halt. Governments cease to function because half the officials are dead. The psychological impact is even worse. People abandon their families out of fear. Parents leave their children to die alone. Spouses flee from each other. Priests refuse to give last rites because they don't want to get close to the sick. The church, which is supposed to provide comfort and hope, is powerless. In fact, clergy die at even higher rates than the general population because they're constantly exposed while performing religious duties. People lose faith in everything, in God, in government, in medicine, in each other. Society is held together by trust and shared values, and the Black Death shatters all of that. What's the point of being a good Christian when good Christians are dying just as fast as sinners? What's the point of following laws when there's no one to enforce them, and you might be dead tomorrow anyway? By the time the first wave of the Black Death burns itself out in 1353, Europe has lost somewhere between 75 and 200 million people. The most commonly cited estimate is about 100 million dead, which is roughly 1/3 of Europe's entire population. 1/3. Imagine a world where every third person you know just dropped dead in the space of 5 years. Some regions got hit even harder. Florence lost 60% of its population. Venice lost 60%. Paris lost half its people. Some smaller towns and villages were completely wiped out, every single person dead, buildings left to crumble and decay. The plague fundamentally changed everything about European society. The feudal system started to collapse because there weren't enough peasants left to work the land, which gave the survivors bargaining power. For the first time in centuries, wages went up. Serfdom started to decline. The Renaissance began in part because the old medieval order had been shattered, and people were ready for something new. But here's the really fun part, and by fun, I mean absolutely terrifying. The Black Death didn't go away. It kept coming back. Every 10 to 20 years, for the next 4 centuries, it would flare up again. The Plague of 1361, the Plague of 1369, the Great Plague of London in 1665, the Plague of Marseille in 1720, on and on and on, wave after wave, killing hundreds of thousands more people each time. Yersinia pestis, a bacterium so small you need a microscope to see it, fundamentally altered the course of human civilization. It ended the Middle Ages. It sparked the Renaissance. It changed economics, religion, art, literature, and philosophy, all because of a tiny organism that lives in fleas, that live on rats. And you know what's really going to blow your mind? It's still around. Yersinia pestis still exists. There are cases of plague reported every year, even now, in the 21st century. It's rare and treatable with antibiotics, but it's out there, lurking in rodent populations, waiting. Sweet dreams, everybody. Part 2, The Invisible Army. Chapter 4, Smallpox, the Speckled Monster. Let's talk about a disease so horrific, so disfiguring, so deadly, that it makes the Black Death look almost merciful by comparison. Let's talk about smallpox. You're in 1520, and you're an Aztec living in Tenochtitlan, one of the largest and most advanced cities in the world. Your civilization has been around for centuries. You've got sophisticated agriculture, incredible architecture, complex social structures, and a military that has never been conquered. Your empire rules over millions of people across Mexico and Central America. Life is good. Then some weird pale dudes show up in ships. They're led by a guy named Hernan Cortez, and honestly, they don't seem that impressive. Sure, they've got some strange weapons and animals you've never seen before, these horses things, but they're vastly outnumbered. Your emperor, Moctezuma II, could crush them like bugs if he wanted to. What happens next is one of the most devastating episodes in human history, and it's not because of Spanish military superiority. It's because of a virus. One of Cortez's men, a guy named Francisco de Eguía, is infected with smallpox. He probably doesn't even know it yet. The symptoms haven't shown up, but he's already contagious. And when he arrives in the Aztec capital, he brings with him a disease that will kill more people than all of Cortez's soldiers combined could ever hope to. Smallpox is caused by the variola virus, and it's absolutely brutal. The initial symptoms seem almost mild: fever, fatigue, body aches. You think you've got a bad cold. Then the rash appears. It starts in your mouth and throat, then spreads to your face, then your arms, then your torso, then your legs. Within days, your entire body is covered in raised bumps. But these aren't just any bumps. They're fluid-filled pustules that start out firm and round, like little beads embedded in your skin. They're incredibly painful. As the disease progresses, the pustules grow and spread, sometimes merging together into huge, pus-filled blisters. Your skin looks like it's been boiled. The smell is indescribable, a mix of rotting flesh and infected tissue. In the most severe form, called hemorrhagic smallpox, you bleed from every orifice: your eyes, your nose, your mouth, your skin. You essentially dissolve from the inside out. The mortality rate for hemorrhagic smallpox is nearly 100%. Even if you survive regular smallpox, and about 30% of people don't, you're left with deep, pitted scars all over your body and face. You might go blind because the pustules damaged your eyes. You might lose fingers or toes to infection. You're permanently disfigured, marked for life as a smallpox survivor. Now imagine you're an Aztec who has never been exposed to this disease before. Your immune system has no idea what it's dealing with. The virus tears through your population like a lawnmower through grass. Within months of the Spanish arrival, smallpox is everywhere in Tenochtitlan. People are dying in the streets. Entire families are wiped out. The city's infrastructure collapses because there aren't enough healthy people to maintain it. The aqueducts stop flowing. Food distribution breaks down. Bodies pile up faster than they can be buried. The Spanish chroniclers describe scenes of absolute horror. Houses full of corpses, nobody left alive to bury them. The stench so bad that people can't enter infected areas. Survivors so disfigured and traumatized that they can barely function. Here's the really insidious part. The Spanish are largely immune. Many of them caught smallpox as children back in Europe and survived, which gave them lifelong immunity. So from the Aztec perspective, these foreign invaders have brought a divine punishment that only affects native people. It seems like the gods themselves have turned against them. The psychological impact is devastating. How do you fight an enemy when an invisible force is killing your people, but leaving them untouched? It seems like proof that the Spanish are destined to win, that resistance is futile. The numbers are staggering. Before the Spanish arrival, the Aztec Empire had a population of around 15 to 20 million people. Within a century, it's down to about 1 to 2 million. Smallpox is the primary culprit, not Spanish weapons, not Spanish tactics, a virus, and this pattern repeats across the Americas. Smallpox spreads faster than the conquistadors can march. It travels along trade routes, jumping from village to village, tribe to tribe. It reaches populations that have never even seen a European, killing them before they even know what's happening. The Inca Empire in South America, devastated by smallpox before Pizarro even arrives. The emperor, Huayna Capac, dies of smallpox, along with his heir, which triggers a civil war that weakens the empire just in time for Spanish conquest. Coincidence? Not even close. Native North Americans, same story. Smallpox sweeps through tribe after tribe, killing up to 90% of some populations. Entire cultures are wiped out. Languages disappear. Knowledge that had been passed down for thousands of years is lost forever because there's no one left to remember it. Some historians estimate that smallpox and other European diseases killed anywhere from 50 to 95% of the indigenous population of the Americas within the first century of contact. We're talking about possibly 50 to 100 million people dead. The largest loss of human life in history, all caused primarily by diseases like smallpox. And you know what's even more horrific? Some Europeans did it deliberately. During the French and Indian War in the 1760s, British officers, including a guy named Geoffrey Amherst, actively discussed giving smallpox-infected blankets to Native American tribes. We have the letters. They actually did it. Biological warfare, centuries before we had a name for it. Smallpox didn't just kill people, it destroyed civilizations. It erased cultures. It fundamentally changed the demographics of 2 entire continents. And it's all because of a virus you can't see with the naked eye. The good news? We beat it. Smallpox is the only human disease we've ever completely eradicated through vaccination. The last natural case was in Somalia in 1977. In 1980, the World Health Organization declared smallpox extinct in the wild. Gone. Defeated. Humanity actually won one, but the scars, literal and metaphorical, remain. The Americas never recovered their pre-Columbian population levels for centuries. Entire civilizations vanished, and all because of the speckled monster. Chapter 5: The Spanish Flu. Let's time travel to 1918. World War I is finally ending. 4 years of brutal trench warfare, poison gas, machine guns, artillery barrages. The war to end all wars is almost over. People are exhausted, traumatized, ready for peace. They've survived the worst conflict in human history. And then something worse shows up. You're a soldier in an army camp somewhere. Could be France, could be Kansas, could be anywhere. You wake up feeling a bit under the weather. Probably just a cold, right? Lots of guys in camp have been sniffling lately. No big deal. By afternoon, you've got a fever. By evening, you can barely stand. Your muscles ache like you've been beaten with hammers. Your head feels like it's going to explode. You're coughing so hard you're bringing up blood. Your skin turns blue from lack of oxygen. You're drowning in your own fluids as your lungs fill with blood and pus. By the next morning, you're dead. And so are half the guys in your barracks. This is the Spanish flu, and it's about to kill more people than the entire First World War. In fact, it's going to kill more people in 24 months than the Black Death killed in 4 years. We're talking about somewhere between 50 and 100 million people dead worldwide. Some estimates go even higher. Here's what makes the Spanish flu so uniquely terrifying. It kills young, healthy adults. Most flus target the very young and the very old, people with weak immune systems. Not this one. This one specifically targets people in their 20s and 30s, people in the prime of life. In fact, having a strong immune system makes it worse because the virus triggers what's called a cytokine storm, where your immune system goes into overdrive and basically attacks your own body. Your lungs fill with fluid, you can't breathe, and you drown in your own blood. The death curve looks like a W instead of the normal U shape. Babies die, old people die, but the huge spike in the middle, that's everyone between 20 and 40. The exact people who should be surviving. And it happens fast, like scary fast. People go from healthy to dead in less than 24 hours. There are documented cases of people boarding a bus feeling fine and being found dead in their seats at the end of the line. One woman in Chicago went out to do her shopping, felt ill on the street, and was dead before the ambulance arrived. A group of card players sat down for a game, and by the time they finished, one of them was dead in his chair. The virus spreads like nothing humanity has ever seen before. It travels on troop ships carrying soldiers home from the war. It spreads through densely packed military camps. It hitchhikes on trains and steamships. Within months, it's everywhere. Every continent except Antarctica, remote Pacific islands, Arctic villages. Nobody is safe. In Philadelphia, they held a massive parade in September 1918 to support the war effort. 200,000 people packed the streets. Within 72 hours, every hospital bed in the city was full. Within a week, thousands were dead. The morgues were so overwhelmed that bodies were stacked in hallways and stored in cold storage warehouses. The city ran out of coffins and had to bury people in mass graves. In some native Alaskan villages, 90% of the population died within a week. Entire communities were wiped out. When rescue teams finally reached these villages, they found bodies frozen in the snow, whole families dead in their homes. India lost somewhere between 10 and 20 million people. Africa lost millions more. In Samoa, 22% of the entire population died. In Iran, it killed so many people that it contributed to a famine that killed even more. Cities around the world shut down. Schools closed. Businesses shuttered. Public gatherings were banned. People wore masks, yes, even in 1918, though they didn't work nearly as well as modern ones. Some cities required masks in public and could fine or arrest you for not wearing one. San Francisco had a mask slackers law. Healthcare systems completely collapsed. There weren't enough doctors and nurses because so many of them had died or gotten sick. Hospitals were overflowing. People died in waiting rooms and hallways, in the streets outside hospitals. In some cities, the phone company stopped working because all the operators were sick or dead. The social impact was just as bad as the physical one. Families were torn apart. Orphans wandered the streets because both parents had died. Businesses closed permanently because the owners were dead. Some towns lost their entire local government because all the officials died at once. And here's the thing that really messes with your head. We still don't know exactly where it came from. It's called the Spanish flu, not because it originated in Spain, but because Spain was neutral in World War I, and their newspapers actually reported on it, while other countries censored the news for wartime propaganda. The actual origin, maybe Kansas, maybe China, maybe France. Nobody knows for sure. What we do know is that it was an H1N1 influenza virus that probably jumped from birds to humans, maybe through pigs as an intermediate host. It mutated in just the right way, or wrong way, depending on your perspective, to become incredibly transmissible and incredibly deadly at the same time. The pandemic came in 3 waves. The first wave in spring 1918 was bad, but not catastrophic. The second wave in fall 1918 was the apocalypse. The third wave in early 1919 was slightly less severe, but still devastating. And then just as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished. The virus mutated into less deadly forms and became just another seasonal flu strain. But the damage was done. 50 to 100 million people dead in 2 years. That's more than 3% of the world's entire population at the time. In some regions, it was way higher. Life expectancy in the United States dropped by 12 years in 1918. 12 years in a single year. The psychological scars lasted for generations. People who lived through the Spanish flu were traumatized by it. They saw their friends and families die horrible deaths. They saw society break down. They saw mass graves and bodies in the streets. And then, because the world was so focused on the war ending and rebuilding, it got memory hold. People didn't talk about it. It became this forgotten pandemic, at least until 2020, when suddenly everyone was comparing COVID-19 to the Spanish flu. But here's the really chilling part. It could happen again. The virus that caused the Spanish flu was recreated in a lab in 2005 from tissue samples of victims. Scientists studied it to understand what made it so deadly. They found that it had some very specific mutations that allowed it to jump to humans and to cause those devastating cytokine storms. Bird flu viruses circulating today have some similar characteristics. If one of them mutates in just the right way, we could be looking at Spanish flu 2.0. Except this time, we've got 7 billion people packed into cities, flying around the world on airplanes, spreading diseases faster than ever before. Fun times ahead, potentially. Chapter 6. Malaria. The mosquito's revenge. All right, remember that opening? You, standing in a trench in East Africa, waiting for something worse than bullets. Time to come full circle. Let's talk about malaria, humanity's oldest and most persistent enemy. This disease has been killing us since before we were fully human. We've found malaria parasites in the blood of Egyptian mummies. It's mentioned in ancient Chinese medical texts from 2700 BC. Hippocrates described it in ancient Greece. The Romans knew it as the bad air, malaria, from the swamps around their city, and it's still killing us today. Right now, in 2026, somewhere in the world, a child dies of malaria every minute. Every single minute. That's over 500,000 people per year, most of them children under 5 in sub-Saharan Africa. Throughout human history, malaria has probably killed more people than any other disease. Some estimates put the total death toll at around 50 billion people. Billion, with a B. That's more than half of all humans who have ever lived. Think about that for a second. Here's how it works. A mosquito, specifically a female Anopheles mosquito, bites an infected person and sucks up some blood containing malaria parasites. These parasites, from the Plasmodium genus, reproduce inside the mosquito. Then the mosquito bites you and injects the parasites into your bloodstream, along with some anticoagulant saliva, so your blood flows more easily. The parasites travel to your liver and set up shop, reproducing like crazy. Then they burst out of your liver cells and invade your red blood cells. They multiply inside the red blood cells until the cells burst, releasing more parasites to infect more cells. Every time the cells burst, you get a massive spike of fever and chills. This happens in cycles, usually every 2 to 3 days, which is why malaria fever comes and goes in a characteristic pattern. Your symptoms are brutal. Fever that can spike up to 106 degrees Fahrenheit, violent shaking chills, drenching sweats, headaches, nausea, vomiting, muscle pain. You feel like you're dying. Sometimes you are. In severe cases, particularly with Plasmodium falciparum, the deadliest species, the infected red blood cells can clog up the tiny blood vessels in your brain. This is called cerebral malaria, and it causes seizures, coma, and death. Children are especially vulnerable. They can go from seemingly healthy to dead within hours. Malaria has shaped human history in ways most people don't even realize. The Roman Empire, weakened by malaria from the swamps around Rome. The American South, malaria was endemic until the 1950s, affecting economic development and public health for centuries. The Civil War, more soldiers died from malaria than from combat. Alexander the Great, one of the greatest military commanders in history, probably died from malaria at age 32. His death threw his empire into chaos and changed the course of ancient history, all because of a parasite carried by a mosquito. The construction of the Panama Canal. The first attempt by the French in the 1880s was abandoned largely because malaria and yellow fever killed so many workers. Thousands upon thousands of workers died. The French gave up and went home. When the Americans tried again in the early 1900s, they had to implement massive mosquito control measures before they could even start building. They drained swamps, used pesticides, installed screens, did everything they could to reduce mosquito populations. It worked, but barely. During World War II, malaria was a bigger threat than the enemy in some theaters. In the Pacific, more Allied soldiers were hospitalized for malaria than for combat injuries. The Japanese faced the same problem. Entire military campaigns were delayed or abandoned because too many troops were sick. The Allies developed new anti-malarial drugs, like chloroquine, and set up massive mosquito control programs. Quinine, derived from the bark of the cinchona tree, had been used for centuries, but it wasn't always effective and had nasty side effects. The new synthetic drugs were better, but the parasites started developing resistance almost immediately. It's been an arms race ever since. In the 1950s and 60s, there was a massive global effort to eradicate malaria using DDT to kill mosquitoes and chloroquine to treat infections. It worked in some places. The United States, Europe, and parts of Asia eliminated malaria completely. But in tropical Africa, it failed. The mosquitoes developed resistance to DDT. The parasites developed resistance to chloroquine, and malaria roared back. Today, we're still fighting the same battle. We've got better drugs, better diagnostics, bed nets treated with insecticide, and we're working on vaccines. There's finally a malaria vaccine that's being rolled out in Africa, and it's showing some promise, reducing deaths by about 30 to 40% in young children. But it's not perfect, and the parasites keep evolving. Here's what makes malaria so insidious. It doesn't just kill people. It makes entire regions economically unproductive. If you've got malaria, you're too sick to work. If your kids have malaria, they miss school. If everyone in your village gets malaria every year, you can't develop economically. You're stuck in a cycle of poverty and disease. Sub-Saharan Africa, the hardest hit region, loses billions of dollars in economic productivity every year to malaria. It's estimated that malaria has reduced economic growth in African countries by 1.3% per year for decades. That compounds over time into enormous economic losses. Some economists argue that malaria is one of the primary reasons Africa has struggled economically compared to other regions, and it's not going away. Climate change is actually making it worse in some areas. Warmer temperatures mean mosquitoes can survive in places that used to be too cold for them. Malaria is spreading to higher elevations and to regions that were previously malaria-free. Cities that eliminated malaria decades ago are seeing cases again. The mosquitoes keep evolving resistance to insecticides. The parasites keep evolving resistance to drugs. It's a never-ending battle, and we're not clearly winning. So yeah, that mosquito buzzing around your ear, it's part of the most successful army of killers in human history. It's killed more people than all human wars combined. It's toppled empires, halted armies, and kept entire continents in poverty. And it's still out there, right now, killing a child every minute. Sleep tight. Part 3. The Worm's Turn. Chapter 7. Schistosomiasis, the sneaky snail parasite. Let's talk about something that'll make you never want to swim in a lake or river again. You're in ancient Egypt, working on one of the pharaoh's grand construction projects. Maybe you're helping build a temple or dig an irrigation canal. It's hot, the work is brutal, and you're thrilled when you get a chance to cool off in the Nile. River. You wade in, splash some water on your face, maybe take a quick swim. The water feels amazing. You have no idea that you've just been infected with a parasite that will slowly destroy your body from the inside out. Welcome to schistosomiasis, also called bilharzia, a disease caused by parasitic flatworms that has been plaguing humanity for at least 5,000 years. We've found evidence of it in Egyptian mummies, including the mummy of Pharaoh Ramesses V. It's mentioned in ancient papyrus medical texts. This disease is OLD. Here's how it works, and it's delightfully horrifying. Certain species of freshwater snails carry the larval stage of schistosome worms. These larvae, called cercariae, are released into the water. They're microscopic, so you can't see them. They're also incredibly good at finding humans. When you enter the water, the cercariae detect chemical signals from your skin. They swim toward you, attach to your skin, and then bore through it. You don't feel anything. No pain, no itch, nothing. They're inside you before you even know you've been exposed. Once inside, the larvae travel through your bloodstream to your lungs, then to your liver, where they mature into adult worms. These worms are about a ½ to an inch long, and they pair up male and female. The female worm lives inside a groove on the male's body, like the world's most disturbing romantic relationship. The paired worms then migrate to the blood vessels around your intestines or bladder, depending on the species, and start producing eggs. Lots of eggs. Each female can produce hundreds to thousands of eggs per day. And here's where things get really bad. About half the eggs make it through your intestinal or bladder wall and get excreted in your feces or urine. Those eggs hatch in fresh water, releasing another larval stage that infects snails, completing the life cycle. But the other half of the eggs, they get trapped in your tissues. Your body forms granulomas. Around them, little inflammatory nodules. This causes scarring and damage to your organs. In your intestines, it causes bloody diarrhea, abdominal pain, and eventually liver damage and enlargement of the spleen. In your bladder, it causes blood in your urine, bladder scarring, and eventually kidney failure and bladder cancer. The chronic blood loss can lead to severe anemia, especially in children. But it gets worse. In some cases, the eggs get carried to other organs. They can end up in your brain or spinal cord, causing seizures and paralysis. They can damage your heart. They can scar your lungs. The disease is chronic and progressive. You don't die quickly. Instead, you slowly deteriorate over years or decades. Kids with chronic schistosomiasis don't grow properly. They're anemic, malnourished, and cognitively impaired. They can't focus in school. They're too tired to play. Adults with chronic infection are debilitated. They can't work as effectively. Women can develop genital schistosomiasis, which causes lesions and scarring that increase susceptibility to HIV infection. The global burden of schistosomiasis is staggering. Currently, Over 200 million people are infected worldwide, most of them in sub-Saharan Africa. About 90% of cases are in Africa. Hundreds of millions more are at risk of infection because they live in areas with contaminated water. It's estimated that schistosomiasis causes around 200,000 deaths per year, but the real burden is in disability. Millions of people are chronically ill, unable to work or go to school, trapped in a cycle of poverty and disease. Ancient Egyptians knew about this disease. They described blood in the urine as a normal part of male puberty in some texts, which tells you how endemic it was. Roman soldiers stationed in Egypt caught it and brought it back to Rome, where it didn't establish itself because the right snail species weren't present. During the colonial period, European powers made schistosomiasis worse in many African countries by building large-scale irrigation projects without considering disease transmission. Dams and irrigation canals created perfect habitats for the snail hosts. The Aswan Dam in Egypt, one of the great engineering projects of the 20th century, also created a massive expansion of schistosomiasis in the Nile Delta. During World War II, Allied soldiers fighting in places like the Philippines and China encountered schistosomiasis. Thousands were infected. Some of them are still dealing with the consequences decades later. There are drugs that can treat schistosomiasis. The main one is praziquantel, and it's pretty effective at killing the adult worms, but it doesn't prevent reinfection. If you live in an area where schistosomiasis is endemic and your only water source is contaminated, you can take the drug, get cured, and then get reinfected a month later. This happens constantly. The real solution is clean water, infrastructure, proper sanitation, and snail control. But these are expensive and difficult to implement in poor rural areas where the disease is most prevalent. So the cycle continues: infection, treatment, reinfection, treatment, over and over. Here's something that'll really bake your noodle. Schistosomiasis is considered one of the neglected tropical diseases. It gets way less attention and funding than diseases like HIV or malaria, even though it affects hundreds of millions of people. Why? Because it primarily affects poor people in poor countries, people without political or economic power. There's no profit in developing new drugs or vaccines for a disease that affects people who can't pay for them. So this ancient parasite, this worm that's been tormenting humanity since the time of the pharaohs, continues to thrive in the 21st century. It's still infecting children who just want to swim in a river. It's still causing chronic disability and death. It's still trapping communities in poverty. And most people in developed countries have never even heard of it. Chapter 8: Hookworms, the vampire of the soil. You're a barefoot farmer in the American South in the early 1900s. You're working in your field, planting tobacco or cotton. The soil is warm between your toes. It's a beautiful day. Life is hard but simple. What you don't know is that the soil you're walking through is contaminated with human feces. Outhouses are common, sanitation is primitive, and parasites thrive in this environment. And right now, microscopic larvae are boring through the skin of your feet. These are hookworm larvae, and they're about to make your life a living hell. Hookworms are tiny parasitic roundworms, about half an inch long, that live in your small intestine, but they start their life cycle in contaminated soil. When an infected person defecates outdoors, hookworm eggs are released in the feces. In warm, moist soil, the eggs hatch and develop into infectious larvae. These larvae can survive in the soil for weeks, waiting for a host. When you walk barefoot through contaminated soil, they detect the warmth and chemical signals from your skin. They attach and burrow in, usually through the feet. You might feel a slight itch or burning sensation, but it's easy to dismiss. The larvae enter your bloodstream and travel to your lungs. You might develop a cough. Then they crawl up your bronchial tubes to your throat, where you swallow them. They travel down your esophagus to your stomach, and finally take up residence in your small intestine. Once there, they mature into adult worms and attach to the intestinal wall using their hooked mouths, hence the name. And here's the really nasty part. They feed on your blood. Each worm drinks a tiny amount, but if you're infected with dozens or hundreds of worms, the blood loss adds up. Chronic hookworm infection causes severe iron deficiency anemia. You become weak, tired, short of breath. Your skin turns pale. You can't concentrate. Children with heavy hookworm infections fail to grow properly. They fall behind in school because their brains aren't getting enough oxygen. Adults can't work effectively. Heavy infections can cause abdominal pain, diarrhea, and protein malnutrition because the worms are literally stealing nutrients from your food before you can absorb them. In the most severe cases, particularly in young children or pregnant women, hookworm infection can be fatal. But the insidious thing about hookworms is that they're chronic. You don't usually die quickly. Instead, you live for years in a state of debility and exhaustion. You're always tired, always weak, never quite healthy. And because everyone around you has the same infection, it seems normal. In the early 20th century, hookworm was absolutely rampant in the American South. Some estimates suggest that 40% of the population was infected. The disease was so common that it became a stereotype. The lazy, slow-moving Southerner. But they weren't lazy. They were sick. They were anemic and malnourished because of parasites. The Rockefeller Sanitary Commission launched a massive campaign to eliminate hookworm in the South, starting in 1909. They built latrines, they educated people about sanitation, and they treated infected individuals with drugs. It worked, sort of. Hookworm rates dropped dramatically, but the parasite was never completely eliminated. Today, hookworm is rare in the United States, at least in most areas, but globally, it's still a massive problem. About 500 million people worldwide are infected with hookworms. That's 1 out of every 15 people on Earth. The disease is most prevalent in tropical and subtropical regions with poor sanitation. Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, parts of Latin America. Anywhere people defecate outdoors and walk barefoot, hookworms thrive. The economic impact is enormous. Children with chronic hookworm infection have cognitive impairments that persist even after treatment. They miss school, they perform poorly, and they have reduced earning potential as adults. Adults with hookworm are less productive, earn less money, and are trapped in poverty. One study estimated that hookworm infection reduces future wage earning by about 40%. Think about that. If you're infected as a child, you'll earn 40% less money over your entire lifetime. Multiply that across hundreds of millions of people, and you're talking about trillions of dollars in lost economic productivity. The parasite is also incredibly well adapted to its life cycle. Hookworms can live in your intestine for 5 to 7 years, constantly producing eggs. A single female can lay thousands of eggs per day. If you're infected and you don't have access to a toilet, you're constantly recontaminating the environment, ensuring the cycle continues. There are drugs that can kill the worms. Albendazole and mebendazole are the main ones, and they're cheap and effective. But just like with schistosomiasis, treatment doesn't prevent reinfection. If you live in an area with poor sanitation and you walk barefoot, you'll get infected again. The real solution is the same as it's always been. Proper sanitation, toilets, shoes, clean water, basic public health infrastructure. But these things cost money, and they require political will, and they don't generate profits for pharmaceutical companies. So hundreds of millions of people continue to suffer from a completely preventable disease. Here's a particularly grim historical note. Hookworms were likely brought to the Americas by the transatlantic slave trade. African slaves were infected, and they spread the parasite to the New World. The disease then became endemic in warm climates with poor sanitation, affecting both black and white populations, but disproportionately impacting the poor. Some historians argue that hookworm infection contributed to the economic backwardness of the American South for generations. A population weakened by chronic anemia and malnutrition couldn't compete economically with healthier populations in other regions. The parasite, in effect, held back an entire region's development. So yeah, tiny worms in the soil. They seem insignificant, but they've affected billions of lives over the course of human history. They've kept entire regions in poverty. They've damaged the cognitive development of hundreds of millions of children. And they're still out there right now, waiting in the warm soil for bare feet. Part 4. The Swarm. Chapter 9. Locusts. When insects declare war. All right, let's shift gears from diseases to something you can actually see with your naked eye. Something that has caused famines, toppled governments, and been described as biblical plagues for literally thousands of years. You're a farmer in East Africa in 2020. You've planted your crops, you've tended them carefully, and they're growing beautifully. This harvest is going to feed your family for the year. Maybe you'll even have some surplus to sell. Life is looking up. Then you hear it. A sound like distant thunder, but the sky is clear. The sound gets louder. You look up, and the sky starts to darken. But it's not clouds. It's a living, writhing mass that stretches from horizon to horizon. Locusts, billions upon billions of them. Within minutes, they descend on your field like a biblical apocalypse. The air is so thick with insects that you can barely breathe. They land on everything: your crops, your house, your animals, you. The sound is deafening, a continuous roar of millions of wings and mandibles chomping. You watch helplessly as they devour everything. Every leaf, every stem, every grain. They strip your field completely bare in less than an hour. Your entire year's crop gone. Just like that. And then they lift off and move to the next field, leaving behind nothing but devastated earth. This isn't ancient history. This happened in 2020. The worst locust outbreak in 70 years swept across East Africa, devastating crops in Kenya, Ethiopia, Somalia, and beyond. It threatened the food security of millions of people, and it's just the latest in a long, long history of locust plagues that have terrorized humanity. Let's talk about what locusts actually are. They're not a separate species from grasshoppers. In fact, they are grasshoppers. The desert locust, the species that causes the most damage, is normally a solitary, harmless insect. It lives alone, minds its own business, eats some plants, no big deal. But under certain conditions, something horrifying happens. When the population density gets high enough, usually after good rains that produce lots of vegetation, the grasshoppers undergo a physical and behavioral transformation. It's called phase change, and it's one of the most dramatic examples of phenotypic plasticity in nature. The solitary grasshoppers start bumping into each other more frequently. This physical contact triggers hormonal changes. Within hours, their behavior changes. They become gregarious instead of solitary. They're attracted to each other instead of avoiding each other. Their color changes from green to yellow and black. Their body shape changes, becoming more streamlined for long-distance flight. And most importantly, they swarm. What starts as a small group of grasshoppers quickly becomes a massive swarm as more and more individuals undergo the phase change. These swarms can contain billions of individuals. The largest recorded locust swarms have been estimated at around 40 billion insects, covering an area of over 400 square miles. Each adult locust can eat its own body weight in vegetation every single day. A swarm of 40 billion locusts can consume 80,000 tons of vegetation per day. That's enough food to feed 35 million people. And they don't just eat crops, they'll eat any vegetation. Grass, leaves, bark, anything green. The swarms can travel vast distances. Desert locusts can fly up to 90 miles in a day, carried by the wind. They can cross oceans. They've been spotted by ships hundreds of miles from land. They can travel from West Africa to the Middle East, from the Arabian Peninsula to India. And here's the really insidious part. They breed explosively. Under good conditions, locust populations can increase by a factor of 20 with each generation. That means one generation produces 20 times as many individuals as the previous one. Within a few generations, you can go from a few thousand locusts to billions. The historical impact of locust plagues is staggering. The Bible describes locust plagues as one of the 10 plagues of Egypt. Ancient Roman and Greek texts describe locust invasions. Chinese records going back thousands of years document locust plagues and the famines they caused. In 1875, a locust swarm, estimated at 12.5 trillion, insects swept across the western United States. This swarm, the largest ever recorded, covered an area larger than California. It darkened the sky for days. Witnesses described the sun being blotted out. The insects piled up in drifts several feet deep. They stopped trains because the tracks were too slippery with crushed locust bodies. This swarm devastated crops across multiple states. Farmers watched helplessly as years of work were destroyed in hours. Some families lost everything and had to abandon their farms. The economic impact was catastrophic, contributing to a severe economic depression in the affected regions. Ironically, the species responsible for that swarm, the Rocky Mountain locust, is now extinct. Nobody knows exactly why. Some scientists think it's because their breeding grounds and river valleys were destroyed by agriculture and development. But whatever the reason, North America got incredibly lucky. Imagine if that species was still around in the 20th century. Locust plagues continued to cause havoc. In the 1920s and 30s, swarms devastated crops across Africa and Asia. In the 1950s, massive control programs were launched using pesticides like dieldrin. They worked, sort of, but at a huge environmental cost. In 1988, a massive locust outbreak in West Africa destroyed crops worth hundreds of millions of dollars. In 2003-2005, a major upsurge affected West and Northwest Africa. The 2019-2021 outbreak I mentioned earlier affected East Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia. Climate change is making the problem worse. Unusual weather patterns, particularly increased rainfall in desert areas, create perfect conditions for locust breeding. Cyclones in the Arabian Sea, which are becoming more frequent due to warming ocean temperatures, bring rain to desert areas where locusts breed. This creates population explosions. Political instability makes control efforts difficult. You can't spray pesticides or implement monitoring programs in war zones, Somalia, Yemen, Libya. These are all areas with ongoing conflicts and also prime locust breeding grounds. When you can't access these areas, locust populations can explode undetected until they form massive swarms. The economic impact is devastating. A single locust outbreak can cause billions of dollars in crop damage. It can push millions of people into food insecurity. It can trigger famines. In countries that are already struggling with poverty, conflict, or drought, a locust plague can be the final straw that causes complete societal breakdown. Modern control methods include pesticides sprayed from aircraft, monitoring via satellite imagery, and early warning systems. There's research into biological control using fungi that specifically target locusts. There's even research into using the locusts themselves as food, since they're high in protein. But none of these solutions are perfect. Pesticides work, but have environmental costs and require significant resources. Monitoring helps, but doesn't prevent outbreaks. Biological control is promising, but not yet scalable. And getting people to eat locusts as a food source, that's a tough sell, even if it makes logical sense. So locusts continue to be a major threat, especially in Africa and Asia. These tiny insects, no bigger than your finger, can form swarms so large they're visible from space. They can destroy the food supply for millions of people in a matter of days. They've been doing it for thousands of years, and they'll keep doing it for thousands more. It's nature's way of reminding us that we're not as in control as we think we are. Chapter 10. Rats, the enablers of apocalypse. Let's talk about an animal that most people see as more of a nuisance than a serious threat. But make no mistake, rats have been responsible for more human deaths than almost any other mammal on Earth. You're living in a medieval city, let's say London, 1665. Rats are everywhere. They're in your house, in the streets, in the warehouses, in the shops. They eat your stored grain. They contaminate your food. They're disgusting, sure, but they're just part of life. You've learned to live with them. What you don't know is that those rats are carrying fleas, and those fleas are carrying Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes bubonic plague. You've heard rumors of people dying in the poor quarters of the city, but that's always happening. No big deal. Then your neighbor gets sick, then your wife, then you. Within a week, 20% of London's population is dead. By the time the Great Plague of London burns itself out, about 100,000 people, roughly a quarter of the city's population, are dead, all because of rats. We've already talked about the Black Death, but let's focus specifically on the role of rats in spreading plague and other diseases throughout history. Rats, particularly the black rat, Rattus rattus, and the brown rat, Rattus norvegicus, have been following human civilization around for thousands of years. They're incredibly successful animals. They're smart, adaptable, omnivorous, and they breed like crazy. A single pair of rats can produce up to 2,000 descendants in a year under ideal conditions. They can squeeze through holes the size of a quarter. They can survive falls from 5 stories. They can tread water for 3 days. They're nearly impossible to completely eliminate once they establish themselves in an area. And they carry diseases. Oh boy, do they carry diseases. Plague is the big one, obviously, but rats also carry or transmit leptospirosis, hantavirus, rat bite fever, typhus, salmonellosis, and numerous other pathogens. Their urine and feces contaminate food and water. Their fleas bite humans and transmit diseases. They're basically furry little disease factories. The black rat, in particular, was the primary reservoir for the plague bacterium during the medieval period. These rats lived in close proximity to humans, nesting in thatched roofs, inside walls, in granaries and warehouses. When the rats died from plague, their fleas jumped to new hosts, including humans. The great plague pandemics of history, the plague of Justinian in the 6th century, the Black Death in the 14th century, the various later outbreaks, all of them were fundamentally enabled by rat populations. Without rats, the plague would have spread much more slowly, if at all. But rats have caused problems beyond just plague. In the trenches of World War I, rats were a constant torment. They fed on corpses in food stores. They grew to enormous sizes, some as big as cats. Soldiers described rats running over them at night, dozens at a time. The psychological impact was severe. You're already dealing with artillery barrages, poison gas, and machine guns, and now you've got giant rats running over you in the dark. In World War II, rats aboard ships spread typhus among sailors and troops. They contaminated food supplies. They gnawed through electrical wiring, causing fires and equipment failures. They were such a problem that ships had dedicated rat guards, metal cones placed on mooring lines to prevent rats from boarding. Rats have caused famines by consuming and contaminating stored grain. In India alone, it's estimated that rats destroy enough grain every year to feed 84 million people. That's not historical, that's happening right now, every year. Rats damage infrastructure by gnawing on electrical wires, causing fires and power outages. They weaken foundations by burrowing. They contaminate water supplies. The economic damage from rats globally is estimated at tens of billions of dollars annually. In urban environments, rats thrive in sewers and subway systems. New York City is famous for its rat problem, with an estimated population of around 2 million rats, roughly 1 rat for every 4 people. Paris has a similar issue. London, Tokyo, pretty much every major city has a rat problem. There was a viral sensation a few years ago, Pizza Rat, a video of a rat dragging an entire slice of New York pizza down the subway stairs. People thought it was hilarious, but it's also a reminder that we share our cities with millions of these disease-carrying rodents. Modern rat control involves poison, traps, and exclusion methods. Cities employ rat catchers and pest control specialists, but it's a losing battle. Rats are too adaptable, too numerous, and too good at surviving. You can reduce their numbers, but you can't eliminate them entirely. And they're getting smarter. There are reports of rats in some cities developing resistance to common poisons. They're learning to avoid traps. They're adapting to control methods faster than we can develop new ones. Some scientists have suggested that rats are actually becoming more intelligent due to the selective pressure of living in human environments. The dumb rats get caught or poisoned. The smart ones survive and breed. Over generations, you're selecting for intelligence and wariness. There's also the issue of super rats, larger and more aggressive rats that are appearing in some cities. These aren't mutants from comic books. They're just well-fed rats that have grown to unusual sizes because of abundant food sources in urban environments, but they're alarming nonetheless. From a disease perspective, rats remain a significant threat. Plague still exists in wild rodent populations in many parts of the world, including the western United States. Cases of human plague are reported every year. It's rare and treatable with antibiotics, but it's still out there. Leptospirosis, a bacterial disease spread through rat urine, infects over 1 million people per year worldwide and kills about 60,000. It's particularly common in tropical regions and among people who work in sewers or around standing water. Hantavirus, another rat-borne disease, causes severe respiratory illness with a fatality rate of around 40%. Outbreaks occur periodically, particularly in rural areas where people come into contact with rodent droppings in enclosed spaces like barns or sheds. So rats aren't just annoying pests, they're legitimate threats to public health, food security, and infrastructure. They've enabled some of the worst disease outbreaks in history. They've caused famines and economic devastation, and they're not going anywhere. As long as humans build cities and store food, rats will be there, thriving in the shadows, breeding in the walls, carrying diseases in their fleas and their feces. Sweet dreams. Chapter 11. Tsetse flies. The sleeping death. You're in sub-Saharan Africa, somewhere in the Congo Basin or East Africa. You're walking through bush country, and you get bitten by a fly. It's a painful bite, more painful than a regular fly, but you've had worse. You swat it away and continue on. Weeks later, you develop a fever, then headaches. Then you start having trouble sleeping at night, but feel overwhelmingly drowsy during the day. Your behavior changes. You become confused, irritable, uncoordinated. Your speech slurs. Eventually, you fall into a coma-like state, unable to wake up, hence the name sleeping sickness. Without treatment, you die. And even with treatment, if the disease has progressed too far, you might suffer permanent neurological damage. This is African trypanosomiasis, commonly known as sleeping sickness, and it's caused by parasitic protozoans transmitted by the tsetse fly. And it has shaped the history of Africa in profound ways. Tsetse flies are found only in sub-Saharan Africa, in a band across the continent roughly between the Sahara and the Kalahari deserts. There are about 30 species, and they're fairly large as flies go, about the size of a housefly. Both males and females feed on blood, and they're aggressive biters. The flies carry trypanosomes, single-celled parasites that cause disease in both humans and animals. There are two forms of human sleeping sickness, one caused by Trypanosoma brucei gambiense, found mainly in Central and West Africa, which progresses slowly over months or years, and one caused by Trypanosoma brucei rhodesiense, found in East Africa, which progresses rapidly over weeks. But the really devastating form affects cattle and other livestock. It's called Nagana, and it has made large parts of Africa essentially uninhabitable for cattle-based agriculture. This has had enormous economic and cultural implications. In many African societies, cattle are central to the economy and culture. Their wealth, their currency, they're used for bride prices. They're sources of milk and meat. But in tsetse-infested areas, you can't keep cattle. They die from Nagana. This means millions of square miles, of potentially productive land can't be used for pastoral agriculture. This disease-induced barrier has affected human settlement patterns, trade routes, and development for thousands of years. It's one of the reasons sub-Saharan Africa developed differently from other regions. You can't have the same kind of agricultural development when huge swaths of territory are off limits to livestock. During the colonial period, sleeping sickness became a major obstacle to European colonization and exploitation of Africa. When European powers carved up the continent in the late 19th century, they quickly discovered that their draft animals, horses, oxen, mules, all died from trypanosomiasis. This made transportation and commerce incredibly difficult. Between 1896 and 1906, a massive epidemic of sleeping sickness swept through Uganda and the Congo Basin. It killed an estimated 250,000 to 500,000 people. Entire villages were depopulated. Islands in Lake Victoria were completely abandoned. The colonial authorities were powerless to stop it. The Belgian Congo, in particular, was devastated. King Leopold II's brutal exploitation of the Congo was already causing massive death and suffering, and then sleeping sickness made things even worse. Workers forced to collect rubber in tsetse-infested areas died in droves. The combination of colonial brutality and disease created one of the worst humanitarian disasters in modern history. Control efforts began in the early 20th century. Colonial authorities established sleeping sickness camps where infected people were forcibly isolated and treated. The treatments were almost as bad as the disease. Early drugs like atoxyl caused blindness in many patients. Later drugs like Millarzaprol, which is still used today in some cases, is basically arsenic. It kills about 5% of the people who take it and causes severe side effects in many more. The British and other colonial powers also implemented brutal depopulation policies. Entire regions were forcibly evacuated to create buffer zones between tsetse-infested areas and human populations. Villages were burned, people were relocated, and those who resisted were dealt with harshly. There were also massive campaigns to kill tsetse flies and their habitat. Trees and brush were cleared over huge areas to destroy fly breeding grounds. Wildlife, which serve as reservoir hosts for the parasites, were slaughtered in enormous numbers. Hundreds of thousands of animals were killed in these campaigns. These methods worked, sort of. Sleeping sickness cases declined dramatically by the mid-20th century. By the 1960s, the disease was nearly eliminated in some areas. But then, in the 1970s and 80s, things fell apart. Post-colonial conflicts, civil wars, and the collapse of health infrastructure led to a resurgence of sleeping sickness. The disease surveillance systems broke down. Treatment centers closed. Wars made large areas inaccessible to health workers. The parasites came roaring back. By the 1990s, there were an estimated 300,000 to 500,000 cases per year, though many went unreported. The Democratic Republic of Congo, Angola, Sudan, and Uganda were hit hardest. In some villages in DRC, up to 20% of the population was infected. The international response was slow. Sleeping sickness is another neglected tropical disease. It affects poor people in poor countries, mostly in conflict zones. There's no profit in developing new drugs or diagnostics. The pharmaceutical companies that made the drugs lost interest. At one point, the only source of Millarzaprol, the most effective drug for late-stage disease, was a single factory in China. When they stopped producing it, there was a global shortage. People died because the drug wasn't available. Eventually, production resumed, but it was a close call. In the 2000s, renewed international efforts led by organizations like WHO and Doctors Without Borders started to bring the disease under control again. New diagnostic tools were developed. Treatment programs were expanded. By 2018, reported cases had dropped to under 1,000 per year for the first time in decades. A new drug, fexinidazole, was approved in 2018. It's the first oral drug for sleeping sickness, which is huge because the previous treatments required intravenous infusions in a hospital setting. This makes treatment much more accessible in remote areas. There's even talk of eliminating sleeping sickness as a public health problem by 2030. But we've been here before. In the 1960s, people thought the disease was beaten, and then it came back. Vigilance has to be maintained. The animal form, Nagana, remains a massive problem. It's estimated that Nagana costs Africa about $4.5 billion per year in lost livestock productivity. Huge areas of potentially productive land remain unusable for cattle ranching. Various control methods are being tried. Insecticide-treated cattle, traps and targets impregnated with insecticide, even genetic modification of flies to reduce populations. But the tsetse fly is resilient. It's perfectly adapted to its environment. Female tsetse flies don't lay eggs. They give birth to live larvae, which immediately burrow into the soil to pupante. This makes them harder to control than mosquitoes or other flies that lay eggs in water. The relationship between tsetse flies and African development is a fascinating example of how tiny organisms can have enormous historical impacts. Some historians argue that trypanosomiasis is one of the main reasons Africa didn't develop large-scale pastoral societies like those in Europe or Asia. You can't have a Bronze Age or Iron Age based on ox-drawn plows if your oxen keep dying from sleeping sickness. It's also affected wildlife conservation. Some of the areas most heavily infested with tsetse flies have been preserved as wildlife habitat precisely because humans and their livestock can't survive there. So in a weird way, the disease has helped protect some ecosystems from human encroachment. But from a human perspective, it's been a disaster. Millions have died from sleeping sickness. Over the centuries, billions of dollars in economic productivity have been lost. Entire regions have been effectively quarantined by an insect, and the tsetse fly, oblivious to all this suffering, continues to buzz through the African bush, carrying its deadly cargo. Part 2: The Modern Menace. Chapter 12: Bedbugs, the Unkillable Nightmare. Alright, let's talk about something that might actually be in your house right now. Something that was nearly eradicated in the developed world, but has made a horrifying comeback in the last 20 years. Something that can turn your bedroom into a torture chamber. You're sleeping peacefully in your bed. It's a nice hotel, or maybe your own home. Everything seems fine. But while you sleep, tiny insects emerge from cracks in the walls, from the seams of your mattress, from behind the headboard. They crawl onto your bed, attracted by the carbon dioxide you exhale and the warmth of your body. They find exposed skin, usually on your arms, legs, or face. They pierce your skin with their needle-like mouth parts and start feeding on your blood. They inject an anesthetic so you don't feel the bite. They feed for 5 to 10 minutes, becoming engorged with blood, and then retreat back to their hiding spots. You wake up in the morning covered in itchy red welts. Maybe you see small blood spots on your sheets. You've been bitten by bed bugs, and your life is about to become a living nightmare. Bed bugs, Cimex lectularius, are small, flat, oval-shaped insects about the size of an apple seed. They're reddish-brown in color, and they feed exclusively on blood. They've been parasitizing humans for thousands of years. We've found evidence of them in ancient Egyptian tombs and in Roman ruins. For most of human history, bedbugs were just an accepted part of life. Everyone had them. Rich people, poor people, it didn't matter. Sleep tight, don't let the bedbugs bite, wasn't a cute saying. It was a genuine nightly concern. But in the mid-20th century, powerful insecticides like DDT nearly wiped them out in developed countries. By the 1950s and 60s, bedbug infestations in places like the United States and Western Europe had become extremely rare. An entire generation grew up never having encountered bedbugs. They became this quaint historical thing, like chamber pots or calling cards. Then, starting in the late 1990s and accelerating in the 2000s, they came back with a vengeance. Cities around the world started reporting massive increases in bedbug infestations. New York, London, Paris, Sydney, Toronto, everywhere. By 2010, it was an epidemic. What happened? Several things. First, DDT and other powerful insecticides were banned or restricted because of environmental and health concerns. Second, bedbugs developed resistance to many modern insecticides. Third, increased international travel spread bedbug populations around the world. Fourth, people had forgotten how to deal with bedbugs, so infestations were able to establish and spread before anyone realized what was happening. And here's the thing, bedbugs are incredibly difficult to eliminate once they establish themselves. They're masters of hiding. They can squeeze into cracks thinner than a credit card. They hide in mattresses, box springs, bed frames, behind wallpaper, inside electrical outlets, in books, in clothing, in furniture, basically anywhere. They can survive without feeding for months, up to a year in some cases. So you can't just leave your house empty and starve them out. They'll wait. Patient little vampires. They reproduce quickly. A female bedbug can lay 200 to 500 eggs in her lifetime. The eggs are tiny, about the size of a speck of dust, and they're laid in hidden cracks and crevices. The eggs hatch in about a week, and the nymphs start feeding immediately. From egg to adult takes about a month under good conditions. The psychological impact of a bedbug infestation is severe. People become obsessed. They can't sleep because they know they're being bitten. They become paranoid, checking every surface for signs of bugs. Some people develop delusional parasitosis, where they continue to feel bugs crawling on them even after the infestation has been eliminated. The social stigma is intense. There's a widespread but incorrect belief that bedbugs are associated with dirt and poor hygiene. They're not. Bedbugs don't care if your house is spotless or filthy. They just want blood. But people are embarrassed to admit they have bedbugs, which makes it harder to control infestations because people don't warn their neighbors or seek help early. Eliminating bedbugs is expensive and difficult. Professional extermination can cost thousands of dollars and require multiple treatments. You have to bag up all your clothing and fabrics and wash them in hot water. You have to treat furniture or throw it away. You have to seal cracks and crevices throughout your home. It's exhausting and stressful. Some people resort to heat treatment, heating their entire home or apartment to over 120 degrees Fahrenheit for several hours to kill all the bugs and eggs. This works, but it's expensive and requires specialized equipment. Others try freezing, which can work, but requires sustained temperatures below 0 Fahrenheit for several days. Or they use diatomaceous earth, a powder that damages the bugs' exoskeletons and dehydrates them. But bedbugs keep evolving resistance to whatever we throw at them. There are now bedbug populations that are resistant to virtually all common insecticides. Some studies show resistance levels 1,000 times higher than in non-resistant populations. These super bedbugs are nearly impossible to kill with chemical treatments alone. The economic impact is significant. The bedbug control industry is worth billions of dollars annually. Hotels lose money from infestations and reputational damage. Apartment buildings have to spend enormous sums on extermination. People throw away furniture and belongings. And it's not just a developed world problem. Bedbugs are found worldwide, but they're particularly problematic in crowded urban environments. Apartment buildings, hotels, dormitories, hospitals, nursing homes. Anywhere people sleep in close proximity, bedbugs thrive. There have been cases of entire apartment buildings being infested, requiring massive, coordinated extermination efforts. There have been lawsuits over bedbug infestations. There have been mental health crises triggered by bedbugs. From a health perspective, bedbugs don't transmit diseases, which is one small mercy. Unlike mosquitoes or fleas, they're not known to spread pathogens to humans, but the bites can cause allergic reactions, secondary infections from scratching, and the psychological effects can be severe. Some researchers are working on new control methods, pheromone traps, genetic modification, even fungi that specifically target bedbugs. But there's no silver bullet yet. So bedbugs, these tiny parasites that we thought we'd defeated, have made a comeback. They're in our homes, our hotels, our hospitals. They're resistant to our pesticides. They're nearly impossible to completely eliminate, and they're not going anywhere. The war against bedbugs is a stalemate at best. And every night in millions of homes around the world, these little vampires are crawling out of their hiding spots, looking for their next meal. Sleep tight indeed. Chapter 13. Fire Ants. The Invasion from South America. Let's talk about an invasion that's still ongoing. An invasion by a tiny insect that has conquered huge swaths of North America, Asia, and Australia, causing billions of dollars in damage and hundreds of human deaths. You're in the southern United States, maybe Texas, or Alabama, or Florida. You're walking across your lawn, and you step on what looks like a small mound of dirt. Within seconds, your foot is on fire. Hundreds of tiny ants are swarming up your leg, and they're biting and stinging with a fury that seems completely out of proportion to their size. Each sting feels like a hot needle being jabbed into your skin. The stings keep coming, dozens of them, hundreds if you don't get the ants off quickly. Within hours, pustules form at each sting site, painful white bumps that can last for weeks. Welcome to the red imported fire ant, Solenopsis invicta, one of the most successful and destructive invasive species in the world. Fire ants are native to South America, specifically the Paraná River region in Brazil, Paraguay, and Argentina. In their native range, they're just one of many ant species, kept in check by predators, parasites, and competition. They're a minor nuisance, nothing special. But in the 1930s, they accidentally hitched a ride on cargo ships to the port of Mobile, Alabama. Exactly how it happened is unclear. Maybe in soil ballast, maybe in imported plants, but once they arrived, they found themselves in paradise. No natural predators, no parasites. Abundant food, warm climate. The fire ants exploded across the southern United States. By the 1950s, they'd spread across the Gulf Coast. By the 1970s, they were in Texas and Florida. By the 2000s, they'd reached California and the Carolinas. Today, fire ants infest over 350 million acres in the United States, covering parts of 15 states. They've also invaded Australia, China, Taiwan, and the Caribbean. They continue to spread, limited only by cold winter temperatures that kill the colonies, and they cause chaos wherever they go. Fire ants are aggressive and territorial. They defend their colonies with extreme prejudice. If you disturb a fire ant mound, thousands of workers pour out and attack anything nearby. They don't just bite, they sting, injecting a venom called solenopsin that causes intense burning pain, hence the name fire ant. For most people, fire ant stings are just painful and annoying. You get the characteristic, the pustules. They itch and hurt for a few days, and then they heal. But some people are allergic to fire ant venom. For them, stings can cause anaphylactic shock, a potentially fatal allergic reaction. It's estimated that about 30 to 50 people per year die from fire ant stings in the United States alone. But it's not just humans who suffer. Fire ants kill livestock, particularly newborn calves and poultry. They attack and consume baby animals, birds in nests, and ground-nesting reptiles. They've decimated some native wildlife populations, particularly ground-nesting birds and small mammals. They damage crops by protecting aphids and scale insects, which they farm for honeydew, a sweet secretion the insects produce. This allows pest populations to explode, damaging agricultural production. They damage infrastructure by nesting in electrical equipment. Fire ants are attracted to electrical fields for reasons that aren't fully understood, and they build nests inside air, conditioners, traffic lights, and electrical boxes. This causes short circuits, fires, and equipment failures. The economic damage from electrical infrastructure damage alone is estimated at hundreds of millions of dollars per year. They reduce property values. Homes in heavily infested areas are harder to sell. Parks and recreational areas become unusable. Golf courses spend enormous sums controlling fire ants. The total economic impact of fire ants in the United States is estimated at about $6 billion per year. That includes control costs, medical costs, agricultural losses, and infrastructure damage. $6 billion every year. Because of an control efforts have been extensive and expensive. In the 1950s and 60s, the US government launched massive eradication campaigns using pesticides like Mirex and heptachlor. They sprayed millions of acres. It didn't work. The fire ants survived, and the pesticides caused enormous environmental damage, killing off native ant species and other wildlife. Modern control methods include bait products that workers carry back to the colony, killing the queen and eventually destroying the colony. But you have to treat every colony in an area, and new colonies are constantly being established by mated queens flying in from elsewhere. There's research into biological control using phorid flies, parasites from the fire ant's native range that lay eggs in the ants' heads. The larvae eat the ant's brain and eventually decapitate it. It's as horrifying as it sounds, and it does work to some extent, but it hasn't eliminated the fire ants. Some scientists have suggested that we need to accept that fire ants are here to stay and focus on managing them rather than trying to eradicate them. This is not a popular position, especially among people who have been stung dozens of times while mowing their lawn. What's particularly frustrating is that this entire disaster was completely preventable. If there had been better biosecurity at ports in the 1930s, if imported cargo had been inspected more carefully, the fire ants might never have established themselves in the United States. But once an invasive species gets a foothold, it's nearly impossible to eliminate. Fire ants are now a permanent part of the North American ecosystem. They've fundamentally altered ant communities across the southern United States, driving some native species to local extinction. And they're still spreading. Climate change is allowing them to survive in areas that were previously too cold. They've been found as far north as Virginia and Tennessee. If winter temperatures continue to warm, they could potentially spread even further. In their new territories, fire ants encounter fewer competitors and predators, allowing them to reach population densities much higher than in their native range. Some infested areas have hundreds of fire ant mounds per acre. The ground is basically a minefield of angry stinging insects. Children playing in yards get stung. Farmers working fields get stung. Wildlife dies. Equipment breaks. And every year, we spend billions of dollars fighting an ant that never should have been here in the first place. It's a reminder that sometimes the worst enemies are the ones we accidentally import ourselves. Part 6, The Microbial Masters. Chapter 14, Tuberculosis, the White Plague. Let's go back to diseases for the home stretch, because we need to talk about one of the oldest and most persistent killers in human history, a disease that has killed more people than any war, any famine, any natural disaster, a disease that shaped art, literature, and culture for centuries, a disease we thought we'd beaten, but that's coming back stronger than ever. You're living in Victorian England, let's say London in the 1850s. You develop a cough that won't go away. At first it's just annoying, then you start coughing up blood. You lose weight, you get night sweats, so severe you have to change your sheets. You become pale and thin, wasting away before everyone's eyes. This is tuberculosis, and in the 19th century it was called consumption because it seemed to consume people from the inside out. It was also called the White Plague because victims became so pale and thin, and it killed about 1 in 4 people in Europe during the 1800s. Tuberculosis is caused by a bacterium called Mycobacterium tuberculosis, and it's incredibly well adapted to infecting humans. The bacteria primarily attack the lungs, but they can spread to other organs, the brain, the kidneys, the spine, anywhere. The disease spreads through the air. When someone with active TB coughs, sneezes, or even talks, they release microscopic droplets containing bacteria. You breathe in these droplets, and the bacteria travel to your lungs. Your immune system tries to wall them off by forming granulomas, little nodules of immune cells surrounding the bacteria. In most people, this works. The bacteria go dormant, locked away in these granulomas. You have latent TB infection, which means you carry the bacteria, but you're not sick, and you're not contagious. About a quarter of the world's population has latent TB infection right now. They're walking around with dormant tuberculosis bacteria in their lungs. But in some people, maybe 10% of those infected, the bacteria eventually break free. The granulomas break down, and the bacteria multiply. Active TB disease develops. You start coughing, losing weight, coughing up blood. You become contagious. And without treatment, about half of people with active TB will die. TB has been with us forever. We've found evidence of tuberculosis in 9,000-year-old skeletons. Egyptian mummies show signs of TB. Ancient Greek and Roman texts describe it. It's been killing us since the beginning of civilization, probably longer. But TB really exploded during the Industrial Revolution. Cities became crowded. People lived in poorly ventilated slums. Factories had terrible working conditions. Malnutrition was common. All of these factors made TB spread like wildfire. In the 1800s, TB was the leading cause of death in Europe and North America. It killed about 1 billion people during that century. 1 billion. It was everywhere and affected everyone, rich and poor, young and old, though the poor in crowded urban slums were hit hardest. The disease became romanticized in art and literature. Poets and writers described the beautiful death of TB victims, who became pale and ethereal-looking before they died. There was this weird cultural phenomenon where TB was seen as a disease of artists and intellectuals. Lord Byron supposedly said, "I should like to die of consumption," because he thought it would make him look interesting. This romanticism ignored the horrific reality of the disease. People coughed up blood. They suffocated as their lungs were destroyed. They wasted away to skin and bones. They spread the disease to their families. Entire households would be wiped out as TB passed from person to person. And for most of history, there was no treatment. Doctors tried everything: bloodletting, mercury, arsenic, fresh air, climate change. Sanatoriums were built in mountains and deserts where the air was supposedly healthier. Patients were sent to these facilities for months or years, resting and hoping their immune systems would somehow win. Some people did recover spontaneously. The immune system can sometimes clear the infection, especially if the person is young and healthy and gets lots of rest and good nutrition. But many people died in sanatoriums, far from home, isolated from their families. Then, in 1882, Robert Koch identified the bacterium that causes TB. This was huge. Now we knew what we were fighting, but knowing what caused the disease didn't immediately lead to a cure. The real breakthrough came in the 1940s with the development of antibiotics. Streptomycin, the first antibiotic effective against TB, was discovered in 1943. Other drugs followed: isoniazid, rifampicin, pyrazinamide. Suddenly, TB was curable. By the 1960s and 70s, TB rates in developed countries had plummeted. It seemed like we were on the verge of eliminating the disease. Some public health officials talked about eradicating TB entirely within a few decades, and then everything went wrong. In the 1980s and 90s, TB came roaring back. Several factors contributed. The HIV/AIDS epidemic devastated immune systems, allowing latent TB to reactivate. Drug-resistant strains of TB emerged because people didn't complete their antibiotic courses. Public health infrastructure was neglected in many countries, and globalization meant drug-resistant TB could spread rapidly around the world. Today, TB is still one of the top 10 causes of death globally. About 10 million people develop active TB each year. About 1.5 million die from it annually. That's more than HIV/AIDS, more than malaria. It's the leading infectious disease killer worldwide, and it's getting worse. Multi-drug resistant TB, MDR-TB, is resistant to the two most effective first-line drugs. Extensively drug-resistant TB, XDR-TB, is resistant to almost all available drugs. Some strains are totally drug-resistant, TDR-TB, meaning there are essentially no treatment options. Treating drug-resistant TB is a nightmare. It requires multiple drugs taken for 18 to 24 months. The drugs have severe side effects. hearing loss, kidney damage, psychosis. The treatment costs tens of thousands of dollars, and even with treatment, cure rates for XDR-TB are only around 50%. In some regions, particularly in Eastern Europe and parts of Asia, drug-resistant TB is reaching epidemic proportions. In some prisons in Russia and Central Asia, TB is endemic, and drug resistance rates are incredibly high. These institutions are basically incubators for drug-resistant strains. The economic impact is enormous. TB primarily affects working-age adults, so it removes productive people from the workforce. Families lose their primary breadwinners. The cost of treatment, even when available, can be catastrophic for poor households. And TB feeds on poverty and inequality. It thrives in crowded, poorly ventilated housing. It spreads in prisons, homeless shelters, and refugee camps. It affects people who are malnourished or immunocompromised. Countries with high TB rates are often caught in a poverty trap, where the disease prevents economic development. There's a vaccine, BCG, but it's not very effective at preventing adult pulmonary TB, the most common and contagious form. It provides some protection for children against severe forms of TB, but we desperately need a better vaccine. New treatments are being developed. Bedaquiline and delamanid are newer drugs that can treat MDR-TB. Shorter treatment regimens are being tested, but development is slow because there's not much profit in TB drugs. The people who need them most can't afford to pay much. So tuberculosis, this ancient disease, this white plague that we thought we'd conquered, is still here. It's still killing 1.5 million people per year. It's evolving resistance to our drugs faster than we can develop new ones. And it's not going anywhere. The bacterium that causes it, Mycobacterium tuberculosis, is one of the most successful pathogens in human history. It's perfectly adapted to spreading between humans, to evading our immune systems, and increasingly, to resisting our antibiotics. It's a reminder that our war with infectious diseases is never really over. We can push them back, we can reduce their impact, but they keep evolving, keep adapting, keep finding new ways to survive. Chapter 15, Typhus, the fever of war. Before we get to cholera, we need to talk about another disease that has decided the outcome of more battles than any general ever could. A disease so closely associated with war, filth, and human misery that it became known as war fever and jail fever. You're a soldier in Napoleon's Grand Army, marching into Russia in 1812. You're part of the greatest military force ever assembled, over 600,000 men, the finest army in Europe. You're going to crush the Russians and establish French dominance over the continent. Victory seems inevitable, but there's something lurking in your unwashed uniform, in the seams of your coat, in your hair. Something so small you can't see it, but it's about to destroy Napoleon's army more effectively than any Russian general. It's a louse, a body louse to be specific, and it's carrying typhus. Typhus is caused by bacteria from the genus Rickettsia, and it's transmitted by lice, fleas, or mites depending on the strain. The most common and deadly form, epidemic typhus, is spread by body lice. These tiny parasites live in clothing, particularly in the seams, and they feed on human blood several times a day. When a louse bites an infected person, it ingests the bacteria along with the blood. The bacteria multiply in the louse's gut. When the louse bites another person, it defecates while feeding. The infected feces get rubbed into the bite wound when the person scratches. Congratulations, you're now infected with typhus. The initial symptoms appear about a week or two after infection. You develop a sudden high fever, often reaching 105 or 106 degrees Fahrenheit. You get severe headaches that feel like your skull is splitting. You develop a rash that starts on your trunk and spreads to your extremities. Your mental state deteriorates. You become confused, delirious, even psychotic. The disease is called typhus from the Greek word for stupor, because victims often become so delirious they don't even know where they are. In severe cases, gangrene develops in the extremities as blood vessels are damaged by the infection. Fingers, toes, entire hands and feet can turn black and die. Without treatment, typhus kills about 10 to 60% of those infected, depending on the strain and the victim's overall health. The mortality rate is higher in older people and those who are already weakened by malnutrition or other diseases. Now back to Napoleon's army. As the Grand Army marches deeper into Russia, conditions deteriorate. The Russians use a scorched earth strategy, destroying food and supplies. The French soldiers are hungry, exhausted, and they can't change or wash their clothes. They're sleeping in close quarters, packed together for warmth. Perfect conditions for lice to spread. And the lice are carrying typhus. By the time Napoleon reaches Moscow, typhus is ripping through his army. Soldiers are dropping by the thousands, not from Russian bullets, but from disease. When Napoleon begins his disastrous retreat from Moscow in October 1812, typhus is in full swing. The retreat becomes a nightmare. Soldiers are dying from the cold, from starvation, from Russian attacks, and from typhus. The disease is so widespread that at some points, more soldiers are dying from typhus every day than from all other causes combined. Of the 600,000 men who marched into Russia, only about 100,000 made it back. Some estimates say that typhus killed more of Napoleon's soldiers than cold, hunger, and combat combined. The disease effectively destroyed the Grand Army and marked the beginning of the end for Napoleon's empire. And this wasn't a one-time thing. Typhus has been a constant companion of armies throughout history. During the 30 Years' War in the 17th century, typhus killed more soldiers than battle casualties. During the Irish potato famine, typhus swept through the starving, overcrowded population, killing hundreds of thousands. World War I saw massive typhus outbreaks, particularly on the Eastern Front. Serbia lost about 150,000 people to typhus in 1915 alone, both soldiers and civilians. Russia experienced a catastrophic typhus epidemic during and after the Russian Revolution, with an estimated 25 to 30 million cases and about 3 million deaths. Lenin himself said, "Either socialism will defeat the louse, or the louse will defeat socialism." That's how serious the typhus problem was in post-revolutionary Russia. The entire country was infested with lice, and typhus was ravaging the population. During World War II, typhus was a major problem in concentration camps and prisoner of war camps, where overcrowding and poor sanitation created ideal conditions for lice. Anne Frank almost certainly died of typhus in Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, just weeks before the camp was liberated. The development of DDT and antibiotics finally gave us effective tools against typhus. DDT killed the lice, and antibiotics like tetracycline and chloramphenicol could cure the disease. Typhus, which had been a major killer for centuries, was brought under control relatively quickly in the mid-20th century, but it hasn't gone away. Typhus still exists in areas with poor sanitation, overcrowding, and limited access to health care. Refugee camps, homeless populations, and disaster zones can see typhus outbreaks. During the Syrian civil war, there were reports of typhus cases in refugee camps and besieged cities. There's also a form called murine typhus, transmitted by fleas, which is less severe, but still causes significant illness. It's found in warm coastal areas around the world, where rats are common. Cases occur regularly in places like Southern California, Hawaii, and Texas. The historical impact of typhus is staggering. This disease has influenced the outcome of wars, decimated armies, and killed millions of people throughout history. It's been a constant threat in any situation where people are crowded together without access to clean clothes and bathing facilities. Armies, prisons, slums, ships, refugee camps. And the vector? A louse, an insect so small you can barely see it, but give it the right conditions. Overcrowding, poor hygiene, lack of ability to change clothes, and it becomes a weapon of mass destruction. The lesson here is the same as with so many of the creatures we've discussed. Size doesn't matter. The smallest organisms can bring down empires, defeat armies, and kill millions. All they need is the right opportunity. Chapter 16. Cholera, death by dehydration. All right, now let's talk about a disease so brutal that it can kill you in hours. A disease that has caused 7 global pandemics and continues to threaten millions of people today. You're in a city somewhere, maybe London in 1854, maybe Haiti in 2010, maybe Yemen right now in 2026. You drink some water or eat some food. It tastes fine. Everything seems normal. A few hours later, you develop diarrhea. But this isn't normal diarrhea. This is profuse, watery diarrhea that looks like rice water. It pours out of you uncontrollably. You can lose up to a liter of fluid per hour. Your body becomes severely dehydrated in a matter of hours. You develop muscle cramps, particularly in your legs, as electrolytes are depleted. Your skin loses elasticity and becomes wrinkled. Your eyes sink into your skull. Your blood pressure drops. You go into shock. Your organs start failing. Without treatment, you can go from healthy to dead in less than 12 hours. With treatment, basically just oral or IV rehydration to replace the lost fluids, survival rates are over 99%. But without access to treatment, cholera kills about half of those infected. This is cholera, caused by the bacterium Vibrio cholerae, and it's one of the most devastating diseases in human history. Cholera spreads through contaminated water and food. The bacteria live in water, often in coastal areas or rivers. When sewage contaminates drinking water, the bacteria spread to humans. You ingest the bacteria, they colonize your small intestine, and they produce a toxin that causes your intestinal cells to secrete massive amounts of fluid. Your body is basically trying to flush out the bacteria by producing diarrhea, but it's so extreme that it becomes life-threatening. The dehydration is what kills you, not the bacteria directly. The disease has caused 7 major pandemics since 1817. The first pandemic started in India and spread across Asia to Europe and Africa. The second pandemic in the 1830s and 40s reached the Americas for the first time. The third pandemic in the mid-1800s was particularly devastating in Europe. During the third pandemic, there was a famous outbreak in London's Soho district in 1854. A doctor named John Snow, not the Game of Thrones character, investigated the outbreak. He mapped where victims lived and noticed they all drew water from the same public pump on Broad Street. He removed the handle from the pump, forcing people to get water elsewhere, and the outbreak ended. This was before anyone understood germ theory. Snow didn't know about bacteria, but he figured out that something in the water was causing the disease. This was one of the founding moments of modern epidemiology. Snow's work proved that cholera was waterborne and led to massive investments in clean water infrastructure in London and other cities. The construction of modern sewer systems in the late 1800s did more to improve public health than almost any other intervention. But cholera didn't go away. The 7th pandemic, which started in Indonesia in 1961, is still ongoing. It spread across Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. It reached South America in 1991, causing massive outbreaks in Peru and neighboring countries. Today, cholera is endemic in many parts of the world, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. There are an estimated 1.3 to 4 million cases per year and 21,000 to 143,000 deaths. Most of these are in poor countries with inadequate water and sanitation infrastructure. The disease is closely linked to poverty, conflict, and natural disasters. When water systems are destroyed by war or disasters, cholera outbreaks often follow. When people are displaced into refugee camps without proper sanitation, cholera spreads. The Haiti cholera outbreak that started in 2010 after the devastating earthquake killed about 10,000 people and sickened hundreds of thousands. The outbreak was traced to UN peacekeepers from Nepal who inadvertently introduced the bacteria. It was a catastrophic failure of basic sanitation protocols. Yemen has been experiencing a massive cholera outbreak since 2016 due to the ongoing civil war. The water and sanitation infrastructure has been destroyed. Over 1 million cases have been reported. It's one of the worst cholera outbreaks in modern history. The solution to cholera is simple: clean water and proper sanitation. if everyone had access to safe drinking water and proper toilets, cholera would essentially cease to exist as a major public health threat. But providing these basics to everyone on Earth requires massive infrastructure investment that many countries can't afford. There are oral cholera vaccines that provide some protection, and they're being used in outbreak situations and high-risk areas. They're not perfect, but they can reduce cases by 60 to 80%. Oral rehydration therapy, a simple mixture of sugar, salt, and water, can prevent most cholera deaths if administered early. It's cheap, effective, and doesn't require medical facilities. But people need to know about it and have access to clean water to prepare it. The fact that people are still dying from a disease that's easily preventable and treatable is a damning indictment of global inequality. Cholera is fundamentally a disease of poverty. It kills people who don't have access to the basic infrastructure that we take for granted in developed countries: clean water, flush toilets, sewage treatment. And it's getting worse in some places. Climate change is affecting water availability and quality. Conflict and displacement are creating conditions ripe for outbreaks. Antimicrobial resistance is emerging in some cholera strains, though it's not yet a major problem. Cholera has shaped human history in profound ways. The fear of cholera drove the construction of modern water and sewer systems in cities worldwide. It sparked the development of epidemiology as a science. It led to international cooperation on disease control, including the establishment of the World Health Organization. But it's also a disease that we've known how to prevent for over 150 years, and yet it still kills tens of thousands of people every year. It's a reminder that having the knowledge to solve a problem and actually solving it are two very different things. Chapter 17. Tapeworms, the silent squatters. Before we wrap up, let's talk about something truly disgusting that's probably more common than you think. Something that could be living inside you right now, growing longer every day, stealing your nutrients, and you might not even know it. You're living in medieval Europe, or modern-day developing world, or honestly, even in a developed country if you eat undercooked pork or beef. You eat some meat that looks perfectly fine. It's cooked, or at least you think it is. It tastes great, but embedded in that meat are tiny cysts, each containing a larval tapeworm. These cysts survive your stomach acid, travel to your small intestine, and attach to the intestinal wall. And then they start growing. Tapeworms are one of nature's most successfully disgusting parasites. The pork tapeworm, Taenia solium, and beef tapeworm, Taenia saginata, are the main ones that infect humans, and they're both absolutely horrifying. Once attached to your intestinal wall, the tapeworm's head, called a scolex, uses hooks and suckers to hold on. Then it starts growing segments called proglottids. Each segment contains both male and female reproductive organs, because why not be efficient? The tapeworm grows longer, every day adding new segments. It can reach lengths of 15 to 30 feet. Some species can grow even longer. There are reports of tapeworms over 60 feet long. That's longer than a school bus, living inside a human. The segments at the far end of the worm, packed with eggs, break off and pass out in your feces. If sanitation is poor and these feces contaminate soil or water, the eggs can be ingested by pigs or cattle. The eggs hatch in the animal's intestine. The larvae burrow through the intestinal wall and travel through the bloodstream to muscle tissue, where they form cysts. Then humans eat the undercooked meat, and the cycle continues. Most people with tapeworms don't have severe symptoms. You might not even know you have one. Maybe you feel a bit more hungry than usual because the worm is stealing your nutrients. Maybe you lose some weight. Maybe you feel vaguely unwell. But sometimes you discover your tapeworm in the most disturbing way possible. You see segments of it in your stool. Imagine using the bathroom and seeing what looks like flat, white, moving rice grains in the toilet. Those are proglottids, segments of the worm that have broken off and are still moving. Some people report feeling the segments crawling out. I'm sorry for that mental image, but you need to understand how disturbing these parasites are. In some cases, things get much worse. With pork tapeworms, if you ingest the eggs directly rather than the cysts in meat, maybe from contaminated food or water, or even from your own hands if you have a tapeworm, the larvae don't stay in your intestine. They burrow through your intestinal wall and travel throughout your body, forming cysts in your muscles, your eyes, and worst of all, your brain. This condition is called neurocystic urcosis, and it's the leading cause of acquired epilepsy in many parts of the world. The cysts in your brain cause seizures, headaches, and neurological problems. In severe cases, it can be fatal, and it's way more common than you'd think. It's estimated that neurocystic urcosis affects millions of people worldwide. The historical impact of tapeworms is harder to quantify than diseases like plague or cholera because they usually don't kill people directly or cause dramatic outbreaks, but they've caused chronic illness, malnutrition, and debility in countless millions throughout history. In the Middle Ages, tapeworms were just accepted as a part of life. People knew about them. There are medieval medical texts describing treatments, most of which didn't work. Some folk remedies were absolutely wild. Fasting and then holding food in front of your mouth to lure the tapeworm out. Spoiler alert, that doesn't work. By the Victorian era, there were patent medicines advertised for tapeworms. Some of them actually worked, using compounds that paralyzed or killed the worm so it could be expelled. But many were useless or even dangerous. Modern anti-parasitic drugs like praziquantel are highly effective at killing tapeworms with minimal side effects, but you have to know you have a tapeworm to get treated. Many people in areas where tapeworms are endemic don't have access to diagnosis or treatment. And here's something that should concern you. Tapeworms aren't just a developing world problem. Cases occur regularly in developed countries. If you eat sushi with raw fish, you're at risk for fish tapeworm. If you eat rare or undercooked beef or pork, you're at risk. Home-cured or wild game meats can carry tapeworms. There have been cases of people in the United States and Europe discovering they have tapeworms. Sometimes it makes the news when someone finds an exceptionally long one. A man in China had a tapeworm removed that was 20 feet long. These stories pop up regularly. The fish tapeworm, Diphyllobothrium latum, deserves special mention because it can grow even longer than pork or beef tapeworms, up to 40 feet or more. It's found in freshwater fish, like salmon, perch, and pike. If you eat raw or undercooked fish from contaminated waters, you can get infected. In Scandinavia, Japan, and other countries where eating raw fish is traditional, fish tapeworm used to be quite common. Modern food safety practices and freezing fish to kill larvae have reduced infections, but cases still occur. The really insidious thing about tapeworms is that they're so well adapted to living inside us that they can survive for years, even decades. Your immune system largely ignores them because they've evolved ways to hide from immune detection. They absorb nutrients directly through their skin, so they don't need a digestive system. They're perfectly designed parasites. From an evolutionary perspective, tapeworms are actually quite sophisticated. They have complex life cycles involving multiple hosts. They produce millions of eggs to ensure at least some survive to find new hosts. They've been parasitizing vertebrates for millions of years, and they're very good at it. But from a human perspective, they're nightmare fuel. The idea of having a 30-foot worm living inside your intestines, growing longer every day, stealing your nutrients, and occasionally shedding segments that crawl around. It's the stuff of horror movies, and yet millions of people around the world are currently infected with tapeworms right now, walking around with these parasites inside them. Many don't know. Some don't have access to treatment, even if they do know. So the next time you eat meat, maybe make sure it's thoroughly cooked, because you really, really don't want to become a host to one of these parasites. Chapter 18. Rabies, the madness. We need to talk about one more disease before we close this out. A disease with a nearly 100% fatality rate once symptoms appear. A disease that's been terrifying humans for thousands of years. A disease that literally drives you mad before it kills you. You're walking through the countryside somewhere. A dog approaches you. It seems friendly enough, maybe a bit odd in its behavior, but it's just a dog. Then it bites you. Just a quick nip, barely breaks the skin. The dog runs off. You clean the wound and forget about it. Weeks later, you start feeling strange. You develop a headache, fever, general malaise. You feel anxious and confused. Then things get weird. You become afraid of water, not just uncomfortable around it, but genuinely terrified. The sight of water, even thinking about drinking, causes your throat to spasm painfully. This is why rabies used to be called hydrophobia, fear of water. You become agitated, aggressive, hallucinating. You produce excessive saliva and can't swallow. So it foams at your mouth. You have periods of mania alternating with paralysis. Your brain is literally being destroyed by the virus. And then you die. There is no cure once symptoms appear. The fatality rate is essentially 100%. Only a handful of people in all of recorded history have survived symptomatic rabies, and most of them had severe brain damage. This is rabies caused by the rabies virus, and it's one of the oldest known diseases. It's described in ancient Mesopotamian texts from 2300 BC. Ancient Greeks and Romans knew about it. It's been killing humans for at least 4,000 years, probably much longer. The virus is present in the saliva of infected animals. When an infected animal bites you, the virus enters your body through the wound. But here's the insidious part. The virus doesn't immediately spread through your bloodstream. Instead, it travels along your nerves, slowly making its way to your brain. This can take weeks or even months, depending on how far from your brain you were bitten. A bite on the foot might take months for the virus to reach your brain. A bite on the face might take only days. During this incubation period, you feel fine. You might not even remember the bite, but the virus is creeping along, your nerves heading for your central nervous system. Once it reaches your brain, the virus causes inflammation and destruction of brain tissue. It specifically affects the parts of the brain that control emotions, behavior, and autonomic functions like breathing and swallowing. This is why rabies causes such bizarre and terrifying symptoms. The hydrophobia is particularly cruel. You're dying of a disease, you're feverish and confused, and your body won't let you drink water. The brainstem dysfunction causes painful spasms of the throat muscles whenever you try to swallow. Eventually, even the sight or sound of water triggers these spasms. Victims become agitated and aggressive, lashing out at people around them. Some historical accounts of mad dog attacks or possessed people acting violently were probably rabies victims. The disease can literally change your personality and behavior completely. Throughout history, rabies has been absolutely terrifying because there was no treatment. If you got bitten by a rabid animal and the virus reached your brain, you were dead. The ancient Greeks cauterized bite wounds with red-hot irons, hoping to destroy the virus before it could spread. It rarely worked. In the Middle Ages, people bitten by suspected rabid animals would go on pilgrimages to special shrines, praying for protection. Some believed that certain saints could cure rabies. Again, it didn't work. Rabies doesn't care about your prayers. The breakthrough came in 1885 when Louis Pasteur developed the first rabies vaccine. A boy named Joseph Meister was bitten multiple times by a rabid dog. Pasteur had been working on a rabies vaccine using dried spinal cords from infected rabbits, but he'd never tested it on humans. The boy was going to die anyway, so Pasteur administered the vaccine over several days. The boy survived. He never developed rabies. It was one of the most important moments in medical history. Suddenly, rabies was preventable if you acted quickly after exposure. Modern post-exposure prophylaxis, PEP, involves cleaning the wound thoroughly and then administering rabies immune globulin and a series of rabies vaccine shots. If you do this before symptoms appear, your survival rate is nearly 100%. If you wait until after symptoms appear, your survival rate is nearly zero. But here's the problem. Rabies vaccines and immune globulin are expensive and not always available, especially in poor rural areas where rabies is most common. Globally, rabies kills about 59,000 people per year, mostly in Asia and Africa, and mostly from dog bites. India alone accounts for about 36% of global rabies deaths. Many victims are children who are bitten by stray dogs and don't receive prompt treatment. The cost of post-exposure prophylaxis can be prohibitive for poor families, and many rural health centers don't stock the vaccines. So we have a disease that's nearly 100% fatal, but also nearly 100% preventable with prompt treatment, and yet 60,000 people per year still die from it. It's yet another example of how disease burden falls disproportionately on the poor. The virus is maintained in wild animal populations: dogs, bats, raccoons, foxes, skunks. In developed countries where dogs are vaccinated, wildlife is the main source. In developing countries, stray dogs are the primary vector. Bats are a particular concern because bat bites are often small and might not be noticed. People can be exposed to rabies from bats without even realizing they've been bitten. Public health officials recommend getting rabies prophylaxis if you wake up to find a bat in your room, even if you don't see a bite. The disease continues to evolve and spread. Different variants exist in different animal populations. Controlling rabies requires massive vaccination campaigns for dogs and wildlife, which are expensive and logistically complex. But the really terrifying thing about rabies is what it represents: a disease that is absolutely, certainly fatal once symptoms appear, but completely preventable if you act in time. It's a race against death, where the clock is ticking from the moment you are infected, but you don't know you're in the race until it might be too late. Throughout history, rabies has killed countless people and animals. It's inspired myths and legends about werewolves and possessed animals. It's caused terror out of proportion to its actual death toll because of how horrible the disease is. Even today, in our modern world, with all our medical knowledge, rabies remains a death sentence, if not treated promptly. That 100% fatality rate once symptoms appear hasn't changed. We can prevent it, but we can't cure it. It's a reminder that for all our advances, we're still vulnerable to these ancient diseases. They're still out there, waiting for us to let our guard down. Part 7. The conclusion. The never-ending war. So here we are. We've journeyed through thousands of years of human history, and we've met the worst creatures humanity has ever had to fight. Bacteria so small, you need a microscope to see them. Viruses that can wipe out empires. Parasites that burrow through your skin. Insects that swarm in billions. Rodents that carry plague. All of them have killed more humans than all our wars combined. And here's the thing that should keep you up at night. We're not winning, not really. Sure, we've had some victories. We eradicated smallpox. We've dramatically reduced polio, guinea worm, and several other diseases. We've developed antibiotics, vaccines, and sanitation systems that have saved hundreds of millions of lives. We've increased global life expectancy by decades, but the organisms we're fighting, they're evolving faster than we are. Bacteria are developing antibiotic resistance. Mosquitoes are developing resistance to insecticides. Viruses are jumping from animals to humans with increasing frequency. Climate change is expanding the range of disease vectors. Globalization is spreading pathogens around the world at unprecedented speed. We're in an evolutionary arms race with creatures that reproduce millions of times faster than we do. A bacterium can go through thousands of generations in the time it takes a human to have one child. That's thousands of opportunities to evolve, to mutate, to develop a resistance to whatever we throw at them. And we keep making the same mistakes. We overuse antibiotics, feeding them to livestock, and prescribing them for viral infections where they don't work. We underfund public health infrastructure and disease surveillance. We cut corners on biosecurity. we allow poverty and inequality to persist, creating perfect conditions for diseases to thrive. The next pandemic is coming. We don't know when, we don't know what it will be, but it's coming. It could be a new influenza strain. It could be a coronavirus. It could be something completely unexpected jumping from animals to humans. Given how connected the world is now, it will spread faster than anything in history. And here's what really should terrify you. Most of the diseases we've talked about today are still out there. Plague still exists in wild rodent populations. Cholera is still endemic in dozens of countries. Tuberculosis is still killing 1.5 million people per year. Malaria kills a child every minute. These aren't historical curiosities. They're current, ongoing threats. The creatures we've discussed today have killed billions of humans over the course of history. They've toppled empires, ended golden ages, changed the course of civilizations. They've caused more suffering than any human-made disaster. And they're patient, they're adaptable, they're resilient. They've been here long before humans evolved, and they'll be here long after we're gone. We started this video in a trench in 1915, waiting for mosquitoes. Let's end it there, too. That soldier, he doesn't know it, but he's on the front lines of a war that's been raging since the beginning of life on Earth. A war between complex organisms and the microbes and parasites that feed on them. A war that never ends, that never produces a final victor, that just keeps evolving into new forms. He's waiting for the high-pitched whine of a mosquito. And somewhere out there in the darkness, billions of tiny warriors are preparing their assault. Not with malice, not with strategy, but with the simple biological imperative to survive and reproduce. We've built cities and civilizations. We've developed medicine and science. We've split the atom and walked on the moon. But we still can't defeat a mosquito. And maybe that's the lesson here. For all our intelligence, for all our technology, we're still just another species in the grand ecosystem of Earth. We're subject to the same evolutionary pressures, the same biological realities as every other organism. We're not separate from nature, we're part of it. And nature, as we've seen today, can be absolutely brutal. The worst creatures humans have ever had to fight aren't monsters from myth or aliens from space. They're the tiny organisms that have evolved alongside us, that have adapted to exploit us, that have turned our own biology against us. They're the bacteria in the soil waiting for bare feet, the parasites in the water waiting for a swim, the viruses in the air waiting for a cough, the mosquitoes in the darkness waiting for night to fall. They're everywhere, they're patient, they're relentless, and they're not going anywhere. So the next time you swat a mosquito, or take an antibiotic, or wash your hands, remember, you're participating in a war that's been raging for billions of years, a war that has killed more humans than anything else in history, a war that we can never truly win, only manage. Sleep tight, everyone, and seriously, don't let the bedbugs bite, because as we've learned today, the tiniest enemies are often the deadliest. Thanks for watching. If you made it this far, you're either fascinated by disease history or you have some serious commitment to nightmare fuel. Either way, I appreciate you. Hit that subscribe button if you want more deep dives into the dark corners of history. And remember, wash your hands, use mosquito nets, and maybe think twice before walking barefoot in tropical soil. Stay safe out there, because as we've learned, the world is full of tiny horrors waiting for their chance. This has been the story of the worst creatures humans have ever had to fight. And spoiler alert, the fight is still going on.